the ecosystem. It's me. Hey, we're in August. I know you guys are trying to get through the off season. I commend you guys for not going completely crazy like I have. I think basketball is still September is a month and a half away, I guess, for training camps, all that stuff. But we're here with Owen Phillips, owner of F5, which is to me the coolest Substack name of all time. That's just my opinion. Owen, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, man. While everyone else is out there on their European vacations, taking a break from basketball, you and me right here, we're waiting with bated breath on news of Garrison Matthews' free agency and
Oh
where's
man.
Alec Burks going to end up and that good stuff. Leave the vacations to everybody else. You and me here, this is where the real sickos are getting it on here in August.
I think for me, and that's where I think I want to start, because I've asked everyone that comes on the show how they're actually getting through these months. And for people like you have leaned fully into the Garrison Matthews, Alec Burks news. How have you kept yourself busy
Yeah.
for July, August, stuff like that?
Look, this is where you separate the casuals from the people who really know ball, right? If you can come up with stories and ideas in the middle of August when there's just no news and all you've got is your imagination for coming up with ideas, I think this is where I really feast. So I've got some good stuff coming this month that didn't really make sense to post in the middle of the season, but I'm kind of excited to kind of see people's reactions to stuff as it comes out over these next couple of weeks.
When you wrote the Garrison, and I'm calling it the Garrison Matthews tribute from here on out. So when you wrote that tribute, it kind of brought me back to how I look at basketball, because as I've gotten older, I tend to analyze basketball in reverse. So what I mean by that is, so let's take the Oklahoma City Thunder, for example, right? They were the best team in basketball. To me, the most exciting playoff series was Thunder Nuggets. And you've heard a number of players talk about on the Thunder saying, Denver probably gave them the most trouble in the postseason. When you look at how the Thunder defend, and I'm talking about their compact shell, like they have a lot 10 feet, around the restricted area, and you have Alex Caruso, Lou Dort being physical at the line of touch. The one, because no defensive approach is foolproof, right? And for the Thunder, they give up a ton of corner threes. The only issue for opposing teams like Denver was that if you go back to that series, Michael Porter Jr. was playing on one shoulder, so he looked really bad, which ends up him getting moved for Cam Johnson, yada yada yada. But if you look at like totality wise, why don't more teams hunt corner threes? Denver, I'm looking at Denver, Indiana, Oklahoma City. They're in the bottom 10 in corner 3-point attempt rate last season, but they're also in the top 10 in conversion rate. So going back to your Garrison Matthews thing, I think Isaiah Joe was on that list of top 10 corner 3-point shooters. Owen, why don't more teams look for that corner three? Is it a byproduct of, because some teams are like, we have our half court offense and it's going to be tailored to what the defense does. Some teams say, screw that. We're going to run anything that we want to run and we're going to power through like a brick wall. But why don't more good teams hunt corner threes?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is that it's important to remember that corner threes are an indicator of good offense, but they're not good offense unto themselves, right? If you're a team that just dribbles up the court and tries to pass it to the corner and take a three, like that's not going to be very good offense, like becomes very predictable and so on and so forth. Also, just like think about who are the types of players that take corner threes. They tend to be your least dynamic and least threatening players, right? You're not putting LeBron James in the corner. You're not putting Giannis in the corner. You're not putting Jokic in the corner. You're tending to put guys like Dorian Finney-Smith, Aaron Gordon, guys who are useful players, but are not exactly the type of player that the defense is most concerned about if they can catch the pass. That said, I do think we are actually seeing more corner threes than we have ever before. I think this year there was about 11% of shots came from the corner across the league. And that's up from about 9% a couple years ago and like 7% 10 years ago. So teams, I think, are trying to take more corner threes, but it's also just has to do with, is the defense trying to allow those? Because the defense also knows that's one of the most valuable shots in basketball. Even though Oklahoma City allows a ton of corner threes, they're kind of an outlier in terms of defenses that do that. I think Houston was maybe one of the teams that allowed the fewest amount of corner threes, and they were a great defense. And I haven't really got a good idea of what Oklahoma City is doing, other than that they trust that their defenders can get back out to that corner very quickly and close out. Right. And also, if you're a team and you're looking at how are we going to play against Oklahoma City, let's try to shoot corner threes. Oklahoma City knows that too. They know you're trying to go for that corner three. So now they can gamble for steals. They can kind of clog up the lanes and get into these
Right.
passing lanes and try to convert for fast breaks the other way. So I wonder if they're making some kind of trade-off as well, knowing that, like, okay, maybe we're going to allow a few more corner threes, but we're also going to create more turnovers because that pass is going to be difficult with all of our limbs and arms in the way.
Do you think we'll ever get to a point where, because obviously you said good teams are not putting their best players in the corner because they have to either initiate the action, be a secondary attacker, stuff like that. Could we ever see a point in basketball where maybe you bring a secondary player, have them initiate offense, and have your go-to guy, like a Durant, stationed in the corner, maybe lift up to the wing? Like, can we see that? Or do you think it makes more sense procedure-wise to have, the least offensive threat that's also a decent shooter in the corner?
Yeah, it's tricky because I think a lot of these on-ball guys who are used to having the ball in their hands all the time, they don't seem to take to that role very naturally. Like I remember
Right.
watching that, Thunder Indiana series, and like one of the ways that the Pacers were able to really like mess up the Thunder was they started full court pressing them and getting the ball out of Shea's hands from the beginning, so that Shea wasn't the one bringing the ball up the court, and now he was kind of in this off-ball role. Kind of see him just like standing there a little bit. He didn't really know what to
Right.
do. And I
Yeah, it
think,
was kind of an adjustment, right?
yeah. And so maybe it's just, it requires teams to just be like, you got to buy into this role, try that. But teams have been trying that forever. Like they've tried to move Trae Young off ball. It doesn't really work. I just think, when you're the kind of guy who's used to just having everything revolve around you, the idea of going and being like Steph Curry, who's very selfless off-ball player, I think is a very hard role to buy into, and it's also just like schematically maybe not the most efficient for your team. If someone's really good on the ball, you don't want to take the ball out of their hands.
Right. You chart stuff like 3-point attempt rate and spacing and everything that goes into that. When you look at the trends over the last, let's call it 5-10 years, are you seeing the NBA take more threes, or do you think that the pace of the game and what teams are looking for in the half court is affecting what the 3-point rate is like league wide average?
Teams definitely seem to be taking more threes. We hit the all-time league high in three-point attempt rate again this year, headlined by Boston taking over half their shots from
Yeah.
three. But for a long time, basically what we saw was that the number of shots at the rim and from mid-range were more or less kind of like, especially specifically jump shots from mid-range, the
Right.
unassisted ones. Those were kind of staying the same. People were still operating in the mid-range. You still had Durant and DeRozan and all these guys taking off the dribble 2-point shots. But now I think teams are realizing that like an off the dribble 2-point shot in the mid range is actually maybe like not as even as valuable as an off the dribble 3-point shot. You have all these guys now who are like able to basically pull up from three off the dribble, which was something that didn't really exist like 5 years ago. Like you had a couple players who could do it. You had James Harden who had the step back. But now, like, if you look at all the most threatening players in the league, almost all of them have an off the dribble 3-point shot and they can put pressure on the rim. And just like that combination is so powerful, I think, in an on-ball player, that it kind of trumps everything else. So I think you're now even seeing some of those unassisted 2-point jump shots that used to kind of be relatively stable over years. Now that's kind of like people are kind of taking a chunk out of that and moving that back to the 3-point line. So you've got guys like Anthony Edwards and Donovan Mitchell who are more than happy to kind of run a pick and roll and then pull up from like 28 feet or something like that.
Where does gravity, because there are a few players like, for example, Anthony Edwards, that have dual gravity. Like he's an effective, he improved his 3-point conversion rate over the last couple of seasons to now it's actually a go-to weapon of his. He's also has that driving gravity because he's a physical force that can attack downhill, get guys open, get his own shot. Does that come into effect in terms of where or how teams are going to attack in the future? Like trying to develop those skill sets? Because, in the past, players were kind of singular. Like you had either a skill set that you could, a great shooter, a great driver, a great passer. We're seeing the evolution of guys where players can do A, B, C, and D. So how do you see that affecting how half-court execution looks like in the future?
Yeah, this is something I don't have like good data on or anything like that, but it's something I kind of feel more in my tummy. But the
Right.
era of the specialist is kind of coming to an end. Someone who's
sure.
only doing one thing, and that's kind of what they're known for. That seems to be kind of being phased out of the league a little bit. And maybe that's why my guy Garrison Matthews hasn't found a team yet.
Yeah.
He does a number of things. I will say I do think he's actually kind of a sneaky underrated defender the fact that he's 6'5" is useful, but primarily he's a guy that you can stash in the corner or put on the wing, and he's going to make a ton of threes. But the era of like a guy who is just known as like a defensive stopper, a guy who's just known as a connective passer, a guy who's just known as a rebounder, that's kind of coming to an end, and you kind of need a guy who can dribble, pass, and shoot, which is sort of how the Thunder were able to kind of steamroll everyone on the way to the championship. Same thing with the Pacers. You have 5 guys who are very dynamic with the ball. And that's like a larger part of this idea that I had been talking about all season, about the idea of the basketball becoming more of a weak link sport, which is this idea that in the past, if you just had one great player, if you had a LeBron James or you had a Michael Jordan, they could kind of carry a team of maybe lesser players just because their skill was so great. But these days, I feel like the worst player on your team is almost as important as your best player. So if you have a player who can't dribble, who can't shoot, who can't defend, that becomes such a glaring red flag for your team's chances of progressing in the playoffs that it's so hard to overcome. Even though the Denver Nuggets have Nikola Jokic, who is maybe the best player in the world, he was also having Russell Westbrook, who nobody was guarding when he was standing in the corner.
Right.
So that made it more challenging for Jokic to operate from where he's doing stuff. If he's playing 4-on-5, it's just harder for everything else to work. Doesn't matter how great he is.
Like, I think the NBA, to what you said, in the past, it was like a big 2, big 3 with LeBron going to Miami. Now, if you look at the Thunder and the former Pacers, it's almost about having a big 8, big 9.
Mm-hmm.
And team depth is now almost as important as individual star talent. When you look at, I guess from an analytical standpoint, are teams going to look at the model that the Thunder had and apply it to their own individual roster build? The Rockets just acquired, like Dorian Finney, they added like 4 or 5 players that can come into the rotation next season. We're seeing teams like Denver do the same thing. Do you think more teams are going to copy that model, and is it going to be successful?
It's a great question. Is it going to be successful? I don't know. Our team's going to try to do it. They might be forced to do it just by the way that the new CBA and salary cap is kind of working, where it's making teams make difficult decisions on players who were maybe right on the cusp of, this guy's maybe a max player. Let's just give him the max. Now teams are like if he's not like a bona fide max, I don't really want to give it to him. That's maybe what you saw with Jabari Smith, where he's like a very good player, and maybe in years past they just would have given him the max contract, and they just didn't do that this year. They played a little hardball with them, and I think that's going to give them flexibility to bring in a Dorian Finney-Smith, bring in a Clint Capella and stuff like that, and it just allows you to make these kind of moves on the margins that otherwise wouldn't have been available to you. I'd love to see more teams try it. I'm really interested to see what happens next year, where you have more teams, it feels like, with bottom-up depth and not necessarily high-end star talent, like the Knicks adding Yabusele, adding Jordan Clarkson, just kind of gives them a little bit more heft at the bottom of their lineups, as opposed to just like adding a star on top of their team. Same thing with the Nuggets adding Tim Hardaway and Jonas Valanciunas and Bruce Brown. So yeah, well, I'll be curious to see if like those teams who focused more on the back end of their rosters are more successful next year than the teams that are maybe trying to add in star talent. Like Houston did both, right? They added really high end player to now be maybe their best player on the team, but they also complemented that by adding Josh Okogie. They added Dorian Finney-Smith. Like, these are guys who are useful players in their own right.
Were you able to, at some point, because I know you have hundreds of Excel sheets somewhere hidden, maybe in the attic or something, but looking at the summer additions, the moves, the trades, who would you put, and I asked you this earlier, purely analytically speaking, what do you think is the most important addition from any player or from any team this offseason? And we're going to do best and either confusing or worst.
Yeah, so if you're just looking at guys who changed teams this last year, who do I think is maybe the most... Okay, and it's complicated, right? Because a lot of the things that analytics tries to do, it's not trying to tell you who's best, it's trying to tell you who's most impactful. Yeah. And that can sometimes be misconstrued as most talented. It's not the same. They're often correlated, but sometimes there could be divergence. And I think this will provide a good example. So if you look at the best players who change teams by Darko, which is sort of the most trusted all-in-one advanced metric for NBA nerds, it's awesome metric. You can go to darko.app to take a look at it, but it kind of gives you a score for how good we think this player is going to be going forward. And the best player who changed teams this past year, according to Darko, was Kristaps Porzingis. He went from Boston to Atlanta. Now, that's a little confusing because also Porzingis was maybe not that good last year. He also was dealing with a spat of injuries. But what he kind of brings to an Atlanta team that's never really had a bona fide stretch 5 plus rim protector, I think is going to be really interesting to see how Trae Young is able to coexist with that, where they have someone now who can not only cover up his weaknesses on defense by being that excellent rim protector, but can also be a pick and pop threat, because Trae Young loves to run 75 pick and rolls a game, and he's a great passer. So he can find that kind of those open looks for Porzingis. And so if he's playing like he's playing in Boston, he might just be the best player that changed teams last year. So that's one. Number 2 was Kevin Durant. Doesn't even need any further explanation. He's a great, amazing player. Maybe had a little bit of a strange couple of past years in Phoenix, but
everyone does. Everyone has weird years in Phoenix. So.
Everyone has weird years in Phoenix. The desert does strange things to your mind. So it'll be really interesting to see Kevin Durant, who has drawn I would say, I feel like the framing of his career now is very strange, where I think now the consensus opinion among people who dabble in analytics and who look at sort of these kind of spreadsheets and stuff like that is that maybe Kevin Durant is a little overrated, but I still think he's awesome, and it'll be really interesting to see what he can do with 4 players that are around him that are just awesome defenders and who are going after every offensive rebound and stuff like that. So it'll be really cool to see how that works. The other player that changed teams that ranked really highly in Darko is Miles Turner. Same thing as kind of Porzingis, almost sort of like a, maybe even as good as Porzingis, someone might say, because he doesn't have that injury history. Those were kind of the 3 best players that probably changed teams this past year. But those were also, players that I think everyone was familiar with. I think maybe it's more interesting to talk about some of the players that changed teams that maybe the casual fan or fans that weren't, maybe paying attention to all across the league, these guys that changed teams. So the guy that I think that changed teams that is sneakily going to have a huge impact on his new team is Luke Cornett.
My answer wasn't as the other Luke, but yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to have some disagreements then about the other Luke. Okay, so that's great because he's on my other list. Luke Cornett was the backup center in Boston, for those who don't know. He played kind of sparing minutes. He has a very interesting kind of skill set and background, where he kind of came into the league as this stretch 5 from Vanderbilt. But he never really made enough threes for it to kind of work. And then he comes to Boston, where they're all about threes, and he decides, I'm not going to take any anymore. And he just becomes this bruising, offensive rebounding machine who's setting these bone crushing picks and becoming one of the league's best rim protectors. So he was awesome kind of as a backup big last year, and almost, helped. He literally won Boston a game in the playoffs when Porzingis went down in injury when he was playing against the Knicks. So really excited to see what he can do in San Antonio. Really curious to see if they kind of try to run some double big lineups where they have Wemby and Luke Cornett. For those aren't familiar, the Luke Cornett contest, where you try to block a shot from standing in the paint. Very curious to see if both of them try to do it at the same time to some 3-point shooters.
That'll be nuts.
Yeah, exactly. The double eclipse. So I'm really looking forward to kind of seeing how that plays out.
So, and you already gave me a foreshadowing, and we're probably going to disagree about this. Now, I have to catch this. Let me go out and first say, when I say Luke Kennard, and maybe this is my fault, I wasn't talking defensively for some reason. I purely was looking at points per shot attempt. Mm-hmm. And this is under the guys that if they really fine-tune his role and not let him kind of, some of the mistakes that the Grizzlies made over the years where they had him on the floor for too long and then it's phased out, and then his specialty, going back to the specialty thing, it's becomes more of a weakness. I think if they're able to harness that, because you can look at the last 6-7 years, he's never finished outside of the, I think, 93rd percentile on points per shot attempt. Extremely efficient with the ball in terms of, he knows why he's on the floor. Mm-hmm. I think if you can use him in some small ball lineups, with him, Trae, Dyson, Nikhil, maybe Jalen Johnson or Porzingis, you could get, if you're looking at a 2-3 minute spurt in a game, he could turn the tide of a quarter or, close a deficit. Now, where it gets tricky, and you'll probably could go to this part, the other side of the ball, because Luke has never been, I guess, the world's most attentive defender. He often gets lost ball watching, and he's not the quickest. So Sometimes the attention to detail, it gets the best of him. But I think there's an avenue, and this is why I think the Hawks had a great summer. I think if there is a way to make him a serviceable two-way option, maybe more so offensively was where he'll stand out. But tell me why I'm wrong.
Okay, so I'll start by saying I like the archetype of player that Luke Kennard is, like this 3-point gunner who is just a dead-eye shooter. That style of player is very appealing to me, not just from an
Right.
analytics standpoint, just from a purely like I think these players are very additive to NBA teams. Shooting is the
Sure.
most stackable skill in basketball. No team has ever complained about having too much shooting. That said, Luke Kennard, compared to like a lot of these other like 3-point gunners like Isaiah Joe or Kevin Herter or Duncan Robinson, he doesn't take like that many threes. Like takes 8 per 100, 3-point attempts per 100, which is good, but it's not like he's like this high volume gunner. He actually plays with, off the dribble a little bit more than a lot of these other guys. He's not just like, catching the ball and shooting it like some of these other dudes. The thing I don't really like about the contract, one is, Atlanta already had Garrison Matthews, and they could have brought him back for like no money. They gave Luke Kennard $11 million. Like Luke Kennard's probably a slightly better player. He's a better shooter, but is he worth 5 times what you're going to give what could have just gotten from Garrison Matthews? I don't know. That's suspicious to me. The other thing is that, as you mentioned, Luke Kennard is a sieve on defense, and trying the idea of playing him next to Trae Young, who is like one of the 25 worst defenders in basketball.
I'm picturing it now.
Yeah,
I'm picturing it now.
Like, again, Garrison Matthews is no great shakes on defense either, but at least he fights, he draws charges, he's going to get up into you, and he knows that he's on a minimum, hoping to maybe, parlay that into something bigger. Luke Kennard just got an $11 million contract for 1 year. That deal seems strange to me because if it's good, if he plays really well, he's going to leave Atlanta someone's going to pay him more money. And if he doesn't play well, then you just paid $11 million for a guy who's like, I don't know, not that good. So anyway, I was very confused by the contract and the deal itself there with Kennard. But I generally like, gunners and 3-point shooters and stuff like that.
Is it more of the money thing? Is it more of the money? Like if he signed for a minimum, would you still have
at the minimum? Like who cares? Like it's no opportunity cost. It seems strange to me that they gave him $11 million when you could have Landry Shamet or Garrison Matthews for peanuts. And again, Luke Kennard's I think a better shooter than those guys, but is he 5 times the shooter that those guys are?
That's fair.
It's suspicious to me.
Who's on the other side? Who are the guys that you think were confusing moves? Who might have a negative impact? Like who are those guys for you? Because I have one in mind. But
okay, and again, this is not always entirely a reflection of who they are as a player, but sort of the combination.
It requires nuance. It's nuance.
Who they are as a player and the money they maybe got in this new deal.
Right.
And so along the same lines, Duncan Robinson is getting $16 million next year. And I understand he's on a 3 for 48 contract and only really one of those years is guaranteed. Next year, it's like partially guaranteed in the third year. Not at all. I don't understand why he's getting that much money. Again, when guys like Doug McDermott are signing for the minimum. Tim Hardaway Jr. just got a minimum in Denver. Detroit just had him. Gary Trent is getting $3 million. Garrison Matthews is unsigned. Landry Shamet's unsigned. I just don't understand why you pay $16 million for a guy whose best seasons were 2-3 years ago. He's approaching, how old is Duncan? He's 31 now. That one seems a little strange to me. I didn't really get that contract. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think for Duncan Robinson, I agree with you. It goes down to his role in Miami over the last few years was diminished. So it's like if you're reduced to a pure specialist, if we're talking about coming into a Pistons team that clearly had a need for shooting, with the Malik Beasley and them losing Tim Hardaway Jr. I do understand why you go for Duncan Robinson. I don't know who they were bidding against, and that could have gone into the market going up. But yeah, is he that much better than Gary Trent? I don't think so. I think Gary Trent had a fantastic year. I mean, everyone's going to think of Gary Trent and the fumble in the playoffs. I think it was that game 5, game 6.
He was awesome in the playoffs up until
he was
that point.
awesome.
He had 2 games that were 2 of the best games anyone played in the playoffs, just in terms of shot making and stuff like that. Yeah.
So I don't know if, and this goes back to my earlier thing about roster building. What exactly are these teams looking for when you look at shooting? Because shooting is not just a one-dimensional skill. Like there's movement shooters, there's guys that come off the catch and shoot. I'm not so convinced that Gary Trent, he's not a better player. He's a better player than Duncan Robinson to me. But is there anything that I'm not seeing in Duncan Robinson where you're going to commit 16 million American dollars for 1 year?
The only thing I can think of is that they felt so, and I don't have any inside information, they just felt so surprised by the Malik Beasley thing that they were just like, we have to replace this skill set with someone who's an equivalent shooter. And, you know, if you were looking around the league for guys who are high volume 3-point shooters, who are dead eye 3-point shooters, Duncan Robinson names come up. But the thing about, and maybe I just don't understand this idea, like, Malik Beasley signed with the Pistons for like $6 million last year. Like, the reason he was such a valuable player is because like he outperformed that contract. Duncan Robinson has to be so good so early for this to like pay off and be a good bet on him that I just don't really get it. The thing, I think Gary Trent, the reason maybe he re-signed in Milwaukee is they probably have some sort of wink deal that if, you know, he takes 2 years or he's played the last 2 years there, they'll give him a bigger payday at the end of this last year or something like that. Because I'm sure he could have gotten more than $3 million from another team. Yeah. They just, you know, wouldn't have had his bird rights or whatever. So yeah, I didn't really understand the Duncan Robinson one. I'm curious to see if he's able to kind of rebuild his value there in Detroit. Because I think he's kind of been, you know, not, I wouldn't say like a negative, but he hasn't been the kind of the Duncan Robinson that was awesome when he was on like an undrafted free agent. You know what I mean? Like now that he's being paid, you know, this amount of money, like the expectations for that kind of player change.
So another guy that I had on my list was Anthony Simons, and I'm curious to see how he compared. Like, where is he on your list? Because to me, I understand Boston had to clear their cap, they had to deduct the tax. That also included sacrificing someone like a Drew Holiday. Which, if you watch Boston last season, it was kind of clear that it was coming to an end.
Yeah.
You bring in Anthony Simons, who's younger, combo guard. He can score for sure. But when you go back and look at Portland's numbers from last season, the on-offs, they were better with him off the floor on offense and defense. Mm-hmm. So if you're trying to deal with Jason Tatum's absence, right? Tatum averaged, 27 points a game. The natural next answer for who's going to step up is going to be Jaylen Brown because he averaged, 21, 22. So he's going to take on the majority of those lumps. There's still going to be some left for Anthony Simons to take on, and he's still developing. So there is a lot of promise there. I'm just curious to see if you think that deal is going to be, if that stint is going to be successful given how he played in Portland and what the Celtics might be expecting going forward.
So if we look at just the number of players, so I think I have right now 89 players change teams from last year to this year. And if you're just ranking them all by this Darko metric that I was referring to earlier, of the 89 players that changed teams, Anthony Simons had the 71st highest Darko score. So one of the worst players that changed teams, perhaps. But, you know, again, it's tricky because Simons in that role in Portland, he's playing for a team that really found an identity by playing like hard-nosed defense, full court pressing, kind of trying to force a lot of shot clock violations and just kind of get into the opposing team's shorts and stuff like that. And like, that's kind of not who he is. He's sort of like a, you know, dynamic pick and roll player who can sort of as a threat to pull up off the dribble and stuff like that. So maybe in Boston's 3-point happy offense under Joe Mazzulla, and maybe they're able to kind of maximize his skill set and not ask him to do the other things that are, you know, that he's maybe not as good at. Just based on nothing at all, I would assume that Anthony Simons maybe doesn't even make it past the trade deadline there in Boston. I wouldn't be surprised if they are like, great, you know, thank you for your services, and then try to trade him before the deadline to maybe shed some more salary. So we'll see.
Before I let you go, I wanted to get your thoughts on double big stuff because I've been obsessed with this whole double big theory. You know, I talked to some people at Summer League, a few executives, a couple of the players. It's really this thing that's like sweeping the nation. Like, you look at the Rockets weren't the first team to do it, but they were the latest team because you have Steven Adams, Prince Şengün. Not all double big lineups are built the same. Like, you look at the Cavs, Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. I think they were plus 12 in like 2,000 possessions together. You look at Boston last season, Horford and Porzingis plus 11.5 in like 800 possessions. AD and Derek Lively, who I think, all things considered, next season they were plus 12.1. Yeah, now granted they didn't have as much time together because of injury, but when you look at what teams are trying to do, analytically speaking, where does the double big rank in effectiveness and do you think more teams will attempt to use a similar strategy?
I definitely think more teams are going to use a similar strategy. In fact, I think a lot of the free agency moves this offseason sort of foreshadows that. Like, I think the fact that Atlanta went out and got Porzingis, I think, is a pretty good indicator that they're going to try to play lineups with Onyeka Okongwu and Porzingis next year. I think they're going to try Moge and Kristaps Porzingis next year. You know, it's a little interesting because also how you're defining double big is, you know,
It changes.
it changes a little bit. You know, like Gershon Yabusele. I do not think of him as a center, but he plays a lot of center. He can play a lot of small ball five. You know, so is Cat plus Yabusele, is that a double big lineup? Like, I don't think so, but it kind of maybe is seen the same way. Same thing with like Aaron Gordon and Jokic. Like Aaron Gordon is not a
Right.
five, but in the playoffs he plays the five. So, you know, is that a double big lineup? Maybe. But I do think more teams are using it because they've realized that one of, I think, like the easiest ways to juice your defense is to have a second big out there and you put them on the opposing team's worst shooter. Boston sort of like pioneered this strategy with Robert Williams a few years ago, where they would play, you know, Robert Williams and Al Horford together, and they'd put Robert Williams on the opposing team's worst 3-point shooter or worst ball handler, and then just have him kind of roaming around the paint, blocking shots. And then, you know, Ime Udoka comes to Houston, and he's like, I know Şengün's not the athlete that Robert Williams is, but I can use him the same way. I can put Şengün on, you know, Chris Dunn, and who cares what Chris Dunn does with the basketball? I'll put Şengün 10 feet away from him, and he's big enough to where if a guy takes a shot at the rim, Şengün can still be there with his hands up. So, like, one, I think it's very situational, right? So if the opposing team is playing a non-shooter or a guy who's not dynamic with the ball, then you can get away with a double big lineup. Against teams that are like, you know, really strong at all five positions, I don't know if that double big lineup works the same way. So I think it's like a nice kind of counterpunch that teams would like to have in their back pocket in case they need it. But I don't know if it's going to ever become the predominant like way. I do have some numbers that sort of put a finer point on like how often we're seeing these double big lineups. So again, a lot of it comes down to how you define a person as a big. But if you look at sort of the NBA's definition of center, last year you saw about across the league wide 8.5 possessions a game of two centers on the court. So, okay, 5 years ago that number was like 2.5. So it's probably 4x in a short period of time. But if you go back 10 or 20 years, it's not as high as it was back then when double big was kind of in vogue. Like LaMarcus Aldridge, he is technically a big, but he played the 4 for most of his career there in Portland, and then for a long stint there in San Antonio.
San Antonio.
Yeah. So it's, again, a lot of this comes down to defining what you consider to be a big. But I do like the idea of just more teams giving it a shot, and I think across the league, like teams are seeing how good OKC was with it, how good Cleveland's been with it, and realizing that you can get away with having two bigs out there if you're using them strategically.
Do you think that the uptick in zone defense plays a part too? Because we're seeing a lot of teams going zone now in the playoffs, especially. Some teams like Houston struggled to, you know, carve out good offense. Like obviously they were controlling the offensive glass and stuff like that, extra possessions. They had a hard time getting great shots out of that once you got another crack at the apple. How do you think that it affects, you know, teams that want to go double big while also realizing that your opposing team is probably going to go zone?
Yeah. It's like a great example of it. Yeah, it was the Houston Golden State series where Golden State dropped into zone and was like, "We dare you to beat us with outside shots," and Houston was like, "We can't do that. We don't have anyone that can shoot." And you saw the same thing in the Nuggets and Thunder series as well. Like the Nuggets made like a bet that, okay, we cannot stop Shai Gilgeous-Alexander from getting into the paint, so we just have to like force him to give up the ball before he does that. Let's play zone defense, and let's bet that Lou Dort and know Andrew Wiggins and Alex Caruso aren't going to make threes. And like it kind of worked for like a short period of time, you know. And again, I think it's one of these things. It's totally situational, and I think every coach is going to want to see it. Like again, just to give some like short numbers on it, this year only 3% of possessions across the league featured zone defense. That's, you know, hardly any at all. It is like a huge uptick though from 5 or 10 years ago, which was around 1%. So you're still seeing it like it occurs, but it's such a small percentage of possessions relative to all other possessions in the league that I think at this point it's still more of a situational, you know, thing that coaches want to have in their back pocket rather than, you know, the thing that they're going to build their defense around.
Oh man, Owen, thank you, brother. I know this is the slowest month of the year. Hope you're getting some fresh sun, some bar. I'm gonna see you around, brother. Thank you for joining the show.
Of course, man. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.